Darkness and ignorance. Ignorance in the sense of lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, lack of knowing, are very often synonymous. Darkness, not seeing, not knowing, these things are synonymous very often. Now, whether we're placed in the physical darkness or metaphysical darkness, we find similar experience in that kind of situation. Things tend to be blown out of proportions. So even as tiny as small bush appears to be a black bear. For example, I was, believe it or not, I was a soldier once. And I remember this one particular scary situation where maybe we were like 200 strong, and this was a real battle. This was a real battle, it wasn't just an exercise. So somehow or other, we penetrated the enemy lines and went in quite deep, way ahead of our left and right wing, so we were nearly isolated in there. And then that first night, this was my first combat experience. Never in my life did anyone try to take my life away from me. So that was quite an experience. And I had to keep guard that night. And I was sent like several hundred yards away from the main camp. And I just hid myself in the bush. I was more hiding away than keeping guard. And I just remembered that darkness. My God, was that scary. I mean, every bush, every sound I thought it was here someone attempting to kill me. By the way, I lived through the whole thing, through the whole experience by locking my gun. So even if I tried to pull the trigger, nothing would have happened. Because I resolved that I'd rather be killed than kill someone else. And then later on had to live with it. But it was especially scary. I had a useless gun on me. But I remember that every single sound, even though I resolved, I was going to just go there, fall asleep and whatever. But no, it was impossible. Every single sound was scary. So somehow or other we survived that night, and then later on we returned a few months later we returned to our base, and it was a really pretty base. It was on the coast of the Adriatic Sea. So this is in Mediterranean. It's quite beautiful. It's pretty. Weather is nice, and beach is just beautiful. And all I had to do was maintain those boats, which basically just meant sitting there and doing nothing, mostly reading. And one night a friend of mine and myself escaped. Now in the army, you don't mess around with the army, especially during the war. Somehow or other we scraped up enough courage to run away. I went to nearby town to have fun. Then in the morning we were trying to return before the sunrise, because that's when they count the soldiers and you have to present yourself to show your face. And we were trying to find our way back, and there were two soldiers, in uniforms, tried to hitchhike through this wilderness. It was just like a big, large forest all around us. It was a foggy night, and no car would stop, And then in one point, and we were a little bit drunk too. And in one point, I turned around and I just couldn't find my friend. He just vanished, like swallowed by the darkness. He just disappeared. And I walked a few hundred yards back and a few hundred yards back again to the front, and then all around. I didn't dare to go too deep into the forest. It was just looking very spooky. And again, I remember in one point there were no cars going by, nothing, and it was just this dark forest. And then the wind, every once in a while, a wind would go through these trees, making all kinds of sounds. Now, if you've ever been in Mediterranean, there is there's an ancient law which is not enacted anymore, but they used to have this law that if you committed a crime on a full moon night during the time when the wind blew from Africa, from south, you would not be held as accountable, just because that wind and that moon, it just had some influence on people, and it was quite spooky. And it was known especially for sailors, when this wind from Africa would blow, that in the middle of a night, when there's no other people around, it just makes you hallucinate. And then you start hearing children screaming, and I mean, your imagination was out of control. Your imagination goes out of control, and it's a very spooky experience. So there I was, full moon night, middle of this forest, no one stopping, and then eventually no cars going by, and this wind from south, coming from Africa, making all these spooky sounds where you hear children crying. And what it is, it's just the pine trees as they move, they squeak and make that noise, like what you call the noise that the door makes. Squeaky noise, like and then after a while you really, even though you heard it many times, those who grew up there, they know that if you hear, that this is happening, and many people before have heard it, and it's just the trees. But yet when you're there in that darkness and you don't quite see trees, you don't quite see children, but you hear this squeaky noise, which eventually you start to believe it's children screaming, and it just spooks you out of your shoes, spooks your socks out of your feet. So this is a typical situation in the darkness. And then as soon, and somehow or other, I lived through all this, and I remember in one point, it was so spooky, I just, first I tried to fight it off. I was trying to be as rational as possible, telling myself, okay, now be rational, this is just the wind. Then I would picture the branches, twisting and in the wind. But it didn't work. And then eventually I just surrendered, I gave up. And then I started chanting Hare Krishna really, really loud, very, very, very loud. And that eventually took my mind away from this squeaking, spooky noise. And then ultimately the sun rose, which was in one sense a bad news because it meant I was late. Meant I would get incarcerated for a few days, which did happen. But as soon as the sun rose, there was just a beautiful forest around. A beautiful forest with wildflowers. Even now, I know we live in San Diego, so we don't see too many wildflowers, but when you drive on the highway, there's hardly anything as beautiful as the wildflowers. When the spring comes, you start seeing all these colors, purple, yellow, red, blue, green, just flashing. It's a beautiful forest everywhere. It was the same forest. Nothing changed. The only thing that changed was the appearance of the sun. So similarly in our lives, if we're experiencing fear, if we're experiencing insecurity, if we're experiencing basic illusion, like I was superimposing, children's voices over basically just branches twisting, that means we're living a culture of ignorance to a certain extent, and therefore real knowledge is lacking in our lives. So therefore, all of the yogic Vedic texts of India, they say that you should seek the association, presence, company of those who are not afraid, we're not confused, and we're not superimposing. Because by that kind of community, you yourself become very clear, unafraid, secure, determined, not bewildered, not superimposing, and live a life of knowledge, the life of light. It's basic knowledge, but we tend to forget. Okay. That meditation has just ended. If you want to carry it a little later, that's fine. Any questions or comments? Or
what happened to your friend?
you know what? We found each other later on at the base. We got incarcerated. We got thrown into. They had this special. This is army. By the way, they can be as brutal as they want to. You sign the contract and to your freedom. They put us in a cage. It was a cage. That's what it was. They put a cage in the middle of the compound in the sand, and the cage was so small that two of us in there couldn't spread our bodies. Couldn't spread our legs and arms. So we were like curled up in there for 24 hours. They told us, okay, go pass stool and urine. You're gonna be locked here without water and food for 24 hours. We, by the way, stole also boat and a car. So they also packed in their engine, portable engine boat, so make it a little more comfortable for us. And I asked him, what happened to you? And he just couldn't remember. He was too drunk. So it remained a mystery.